Hello there, and welcome. Whether you're joining us again or finding this little nook of quiet for the first time, you are so very welcome. This is your sanctuary of stillness, your quiet resting place, where history flows like a gentle stream and sleep finds you softly. Tonight, we invite you to close the door to the noise of the day, to step away from the rush, the screens, the lists, and the demands, and to sink into something slower, simpler, and older. Much, much older. Because tonight, we're traveling back to the medieval world. Not to castles or kings, not to knights or battles, but to something far more intimate and human, the art of washing. Yes, laundry, but not the kind you toss into a machine and forget. We're talking about laundry the old way, the medieval way, when rivers were sacred tools of daily life and washing clothes was a ritual of effort, rhythm, and community. We'll stroll gently along the riverbanks of a time gone by, where women gathered at dawn, their hands raw from lye soap and water, their voices rising and falling like music as they scrubbed away the dirt of the day. We'll watch the seasons pass, a warm harvest afternoon with linens flapping in the breeze, a cool rainy wash day with mist hanging over the water, and a quiet winter morning when steam curls up from wooden tubs like smoke from a dream. There are no alarms here, no deadlines, no noise, just the steady, soothing sound of cloth being wrung, of water splashing against stone, of peaceful labor in a world where time moves slowly, and people did too. So tonight, I invite you to breathe deeply, to let go of the tension in your shoulders, and to let this story lull you into sleep like the gentle lap of a river against the shore. Let the warmth of the past wrap around you like a soft, freshly washed wool blanket. Let the echo of ancient voices and daily rituals rock you gently toward slumber. Settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself drift, back in time and into rest. This is your quiet journey through medieval laundry life, and it begins now. Welcome to Slumberous Historian. Tonight, we take a long, slow, and uneventful journey into the washing habits of the medieval world. A world without detergent, without machines, without scented fabric softeners. And yet, somehow, people still clean their clothes, and they did it with great care and great patience. So settle in, perhaps lie down, let your eyes grow heavy as we travel back in time to a world of wool, linen, and water. Let us begin, not with washing itself, but with the garments themselves. In the medieval world, what people wore told you everything about who they were, their status, their wealth, their gender, their labor, even their sins and their piety. Yet, beneath the hierarchy of symbolism lay something simpler and more practical. These garments absorbed sweat, gathered dust, and despite their often humble construction, needed to be cleaned. But how they were cleaned depended greatly on what they were made of. In early medieval Europe, two materials dominated everyday clothing: linen and wool. Linen was made from the flax plant, a plant with blue flowers and fibrous stalks that had to be carefully harvested, dried, soaked, and beaten before yielding the soft fibers within. Once spun into thread and woven into cloth, it became light, smooth, and surprisingly durable. Linen was often used for undergarment, items worn close to the skin: chemises, shirts, braids, and head coverings. These were the pieces that soaked up sweat, body oils, and grime from labor. And so, these linens were the items washed most frequently, if we can even call a few times a year frequent. Wool was another matter. Wool came from sheep, of course, but medieval sheep were not the fluffy white creatures you may imagine today. Their wool was coarse, greasy, filled with lanolin, a natural oil that made wool both water-resistant and hard to clean. Wool was used for outerwear: tunics, cloaks, hoods, hose. Because wool didn't touch the body directly, and because it was difficult to dry thoroughly without risk of shrinking or damage, people tended to clean it less frequently. Instead, they aired it out. They beat it with sticks. They brushed it, and only occasionally did they dare soak it. For most people, woolen garments might go months, even years, without a true wash. Now, we must remember, garment quality and quantity were deeply tied to class. A nobleman's closet might contain several tunics of fine wool or even imported silk or velvet. A peasant's wardrobe consisted of perhaps 2 or 3 main items. For the average villager, a single linen undergarment and a single outer tunic might be worn every day for weeks at a time. That means the act of washing was not just a task of hygiene, but of risk. To soak your only shirt meant going without one for as long as it took to dry.
This was especially risky in colder seasons, hence why many people postponed laundering until spring or summer. Washing was seasonal, calculated, tied not just to cleanliness, but survival. The way people dressed also affected how laundry was approached. People wore layers, a linen shift or shirt next to the skin, then a tunic, then a cloak or mantle. This meant that only the innermost layer absorbed the bulk of sweat and oils. That's the one that needed cleaning. Outer garments, especially expensive or dyed ones, were rarely washed. Instead, people focused their efforts on keeping the underlayers clean. This was efficient, and in an age when heating water meant building a fire, and when labor was life-consuming, efficiency mattered. Some materials, especially wool, were dyed using natural pigments. Madder root for red, wood for blue, walnut husk for brown. These dyes were not always stable. Washing could cause them to fade or bleed. For this reason, brightly colored garments were rarely, if ever, submerged in water. People preferred to brush them, spot clean them, or hang them in sunlight to air out odors. Sunlight had the dual effect of drying and disinfecting, a slow, natural purification. Dirt was not seen as a sign of laziness. In many communities, it was simply accepted. You worked in dirt, you lived near livestock, you cooked over open fires, and you walked through unpaved roads. Dust and grime were normal. Washing was not expected to eliminate them entirely, only to manage them, once in a while. Before clothing was washed, it was often mended, a tear, a fray, a worn-out seam. Linen was prone to fraying. Wool could be stretched out. Before laundering, women and servants would sit, examining each item. They would restitch, patch, reinforce. This was vital as a wet garment was heavy. Any existing tear could become a ruin once soaked. Thus, the act of preparing for laundry often began with sewing. Certain garments had specific rules. Hose, worn on the legs by both men and women, were made of wool, often cut on the bias, to allow stretching. These were rarely washed, but rather hung by the fire, brushed out, and smoked. Yes, smoke played a role in medieval clothing care. Fireplaces doubled as fumigators. Clothes left hanging above the hearth absorbed warmth and scent and were believed to be cleansed by the air. Even cloaks, heavy and woolen, might spend a night on a wooden frame near the embers. This was not a full cleaning, but a refresh, and it was enough. One might assume that medieval people were unhygienic, but this was not always the case. They understood that dirt could cause discomfort and even illness. What they lacked was soap as we know it. Hard, bar-like soaps were expensive and often used for the body, not fabric. Instead, people relied on materials at hand: ash, sand, chalk, urine, herbs. These things served as mild abrasives, deodorizers, and soft cleansers. Sometimes they were mixed into cloth during weaving. Other times, they were added to water during the soak. But the idea was always the same: clean, just enough. Not sterile, not perfect, but livable. And so we begin to understand not only what people wore, but how the clothing itself informed their relationship to cleanliness, to time, to labor. A simple chemise held more meaning than we might think. It was a barrier, a shield, and a burden a reminder that even in ages past, the act of doing laundry was never merely about soap, but about survival and care. Let us now move onward into the washing itself. Let us now step away from the hearth and into the open world, to the sounds of moving water and the steady rhythm of paddles meeting wet cloth. In medieval Europe, doing laundry was never as simple as turning on a tap or pouring out detergent. It was an act of intention, of labor, of community, and above all, proximity to nature. To wash clothes was to engage in a relationship with the land itself, where washing took place. In the absence of indoor plumbing, streams and rivers were not just essential, they were sacred lifelines for daily life. These were the washing stations of the common people. Far from being private affairs, laundry days were often communal, noisy, and laborious events, especially for women, who bore most of the responsibility. Small brooks, large rivers, even rain-fed ponds, each served as a site for rinsing and scrubbing, though moving water was always preferred. Why? Because flowing water carried dirt and suds away. Still water became quickly fouled, and sometimes even sacred, forbidden for such unclean uses. For many, the act of laundry began long before the washing itself. It began with a walk. Peasant women might carry bundles of soiled linen wrapped tightly in coarse cloth or packed into wicker baskets. Some used wooden yokes to balance heavy loads on their shoulders. Others simply tied garments into slings and carried them on their backs. The elderly joined slowly, with the young helping to lift, stack, and carry. These journeys were seasonal and intentional. They were rarely rushed. In spring and early summer, rivers ran clear and full. In autumn, leaves drifted into the streams, turning the water dark. In winter, the cold could make washing nearly impossible. Clothes would freeze before they dried. Thus, choosing the time was just as important as choosing the place. The washing setup. At the water's edge, women claimed flat stones or smooth banks where they could kneel or squat. Some brought wooden boards, others used the flat beetling stones that nature provided. The tools were few but vital. A paddle or beetle, flat, wooden, often hand-carved, used for pounding clothes, a rinsing basket, to keep garments from floating away, a ladle or bowl, for scooping and pouring water, and occasionally, a scrubbing brush made from bundled plant fibers or coarse animal hair. Garments were submerged in the river and pulled out, heavy with water. They were slapped against stones, beaten with beetles, scrubbed with ash, clay, or even sand. Washing was more about dislodging dirt than dissolving it. Without commercial soap, medieval women used ash water, a mild alkaline lye made from wood ash steeped in water. Chamber lye, stale urine collected and fermented, rich in ammonia. Fuller's earth or clay, natural absorbers of grease and oil. Herbs like lavender or rosemary, sometimes added to mask odors. These substances helped lift oil and odor, but only with physical effort. Hands grew raw, nails broke, wrists ached. Still, the washing continued, beating and rinsing. Pounding the garments with beetles was essential. It softened the fibers, dislodged embedded grime, and fluffed the weave of linen. The sound of beetles striking wet cloth echoed down the riverbank. Thump, slap, slosh. A chorus of labor. Clothes were rinsed and wrung multiple times. Hands twisted the cloth tightly, pushing water out. This reduced drying time, but also wore down the fibers. Some women added a final rinse with lightly scented herbs or cold, clear water from a separate jug. The act of rinsing was seen as sacred in some regions, almost symbolic of purification. Clothing types and washing care. Not all clothes were washed the same way. Linen undergarments, soaked in sweat and body oils, were scrubbed and rinsed most often. Woolen tunics, cloaks, and hose were washed rarely. Water could shrink them or ruin their texture. Dyed garments were treated gently, lest their colors bleed. In many cases, outer garments were never washed at all. Instead, they were brushed, aired out, and sometimes smoked over herbs to freshen them. Even bedding, straw mattresses, woolen blankets, were not washed, but aired in the sun and beaten with sticks. Garments were categorized not by color, but by how close they touched the body. The closer to the skin, the more frequently they were washed. The social side of washing. Though tiring, laundry day was also a social gathering. Neighbors talked, gossiped, shared food, sang old folk songs. Older women taught younger girls proper wringing techniques, stain remedies, and when to apply lye. It was not uncommon for women to joke about the sins they were beating out of their husbands' shirts. In some towns, wash houses, called lavoirs in France or buanderies in England, were set up with roofs, benches, and basins. These were rare and usually reserved for wealthier districts or religious communities. Most rural folk relied solely on the riverside, but even there, some traditions were sacred. A first-time bride was taught the family's washing site, cloths used for babies, or the dead were rinsed apart from others. Washing water was not to be wasted or polluted unnecessarily. Even dirty laundry had its codes of honor. Laundry was dictated by weather. A cloudy day might delay drying. A surprise rainstorm could ruin a week's work. A drought made washing dangerous, especially where water was scarce. Sometimes, women waited days for the perfect time to wash. In hot months, water was clearer, but dried up faster. In cold months, fingers froze and garments stiffened with ice. Washing during winter was rare. If it had to be done, it was done indoors, laboriously, with boiled water, tubs, and heated stones. Yet, even then, it never matched the power of a good river rinse. Once rinsed, garments were gently laid out to dry. Some were draped across hedges. Others were hung from ropes strung between trees. Large cloaks were often spread over flat stones to sun bleach. In some regions, clothes were pinned with thorns or tied down with small rocks. Linen loved the sun. It turned whiter, cleaner, and smelled sweet. Wool, however, was dried in the shade to avoid shrinking and fading. Children were often tasked with guarding the drying clothes, chasing off goats, birds, and curious passers-by. Wool took longer. Linen dried fast, especially in a breeze. Drying could take all day, or 2 or 3. No one left clothes overnight, lest they be stolen, dampened with dew, or soiled by animals. Respecting the river. Rivers were more than laundry sites. They were drinking sources, fishing grounds, and sometimes even sacred places. That meant washing practices had to be respectful. Soaps and cleaning agents were biodegradable. Solid waste was never dumped in main water sources. In some regions, rules were posted or passed down orally about when and where you could wash. Some rivers had women's stones, carved over decades by elbows and knees. Others had shrine markers, acknowledging the spirit of the water. A woman washing improperly could face scolding, or worse, because to misuse the river was to endanger the entire village. And so, the washing ended, with sore arms, wrinkled hands, and clothes spread like flags of labor across the landscape. The act was tiring, yes, but also sacred. It reminded everyone of their place in the seasons, their dependency on nature, and the rhythm of life. Laundry, in the medieval world, was not just a chore. It was a story told in suds and silence, in water and wind, in beetles striking stone, and voices rising in the afternoon sun. It was both work and ritual. And now, with our garments rinsed and drying on the line, let us move to the next step in this centuries-old rhythm. The full cycle of medieval laundry. Now that we've laid our garments across the riverbanks and watched the breeze tease the linen as it dries, let's step back in time once more. To understand how laundry was not just a one-off act, but a carefully structured cycle that governed the rhythm of medieval life. Washing was rare, and that was normal. In our modern world, laundry is often a daily or weekly chore, but in the medieval period, it was anything but regular. People owned few garments. Most common folk might have 1 or 2 undershirts, a tunic or kirtle, a woolen cloak, and perhaps a spare set if they were lucky. This made conservation and timing critical. Laundry was not done weekly. It was done when it was absolutely needed, when clothing became too soiled, smelly, or visibly stained. And more often than not, it was done seasonally. The Great Wash. Among the most anticipated and labor-intensive events in a household or monastic community was the Great Wash. This was a scheduled, collective effort, planned days or even weeks in advance. Most frequently held in spring or early summer, when the weather was warm and water was plentiful, The Great Wash was an event of immense importance. Preparations began well before the clothes met water. Ash had to be gathered from hearths. Clean, dry, hardwood ash was best. Urine had to be saved and allowed to ferment. Large wooden tubs were cleaned and set up. Scrubbing stones were checked and rinsed. Herbs were harvested or dried in preparation for later rinsing. Everything had to be ready. Before the first drop of water touched cloth, clothes were carefully sorted, not by color, but by fabric type: linen, wool, silk, garment function, undergarment, outerwear, ceremonial use, soiling level, and delicacy. Underclothes, which absorbed sweat and skin oils, were washed first and most thoroughly. Outer garments, especially woolen cloaks or dyed items, were often brushed, aired, or spot cleaned, but rarely soaked. Items embroidered with gold thread, decorated with beads, or made from imported silks were handled separately, often with dry methods such as gentle dusting or beating with rods. Garments with holes or torn seams were mended first because washing could worsen damage. The first real phase of washing was soaking. Garments were submerged in water to loosen dirt and soften fibers. In colder months, this was done with boiled water, heated over hearth fires, and poured into wooden tubs or barrels. In warmer months, river or stream water was sufficient. Sometimes, clothing was soaked for hours, or even overnight. Into this water went the cleaning agents. Ash lye, made by pouring boiling water over a cloth sack of ash and letting the mixture steep. Chamber lye, urine, sometimes warmed and applied directly to greasy areas, fuller's earth or white clay, dissolved into paste and rubbed into stubborn stains. The soak itself began to break down grime, but the real work was still to come: agitating and scrubbing. Once soaked, clothing needed agitation. Hands, wooden plungers, sticks, or paddles were used to stir, swish, lift, and squeeze the fabric. The scrubbing process was tough. Clothes were lifted from the soaking tubs and laid across flat stones or wooden boards. Using beetles or scrubbing tools, women pounded and scrubbed the cloth in a repetitive, rhythmic pattern. Sand was sometimes added to heavily soiled spots, acting as an abrasive. Stains from sweat, soil, or cooking grease were worked out by hand, over and over. This was especially exhausting for woolen clothes. They had to be washed gently to avoid felting. If agitation was too rough, wool fibers would lock together, creating a stiff, shrunken garment. So wool was often dabbed, pressed, or very lightly agitated. Linen, however, could be beaten with great vigor. Multiple rinses, a ritual in itself. Once scrubbed, garments had to be rinsed. Thorough rinsing was critical, especially when ash lye or chamber lye was used. Residual lye could burn skin or damage fabric if not fully removed. Rinsing happened in fresh water, either in the river or in clean barrels filled and refilled multiple times. Clothes were lifted, swished, squeezed, and then wrung by hand. Some women used flat boards to press water out. Others used ropes to twist and wring fabric between two people. Rinsing was often done 3, 4, or even 5 times until the water ran clear and the smell of lye or ammonia was gone. This process could take all day, and it wasn't quiet. It involved conversations, singing, storytelling, creating a sense of shared labor and community. After rinsing, some women added a final rinse with herbs. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, sage, mint, wormwood were steeped in hot water and poured over clothing. This was not just for fragrance. Many herbs repelled moths, lice, and fleas, a real concern when clothing might not be washed again for months. Scented water was especially used for undergarments, linens for the sick, or cloth used in religious rituals. In wealthier households, rose water, orange blossom, or vinegar solutions were also used. Once rinsed and infused, garments had to be dried quickly and carefully. In some households, drying lines were permanent features. In others, garments were draped over hedges, thatched roofs, or smooth rocks. Delicate or colorful items were dried in the shade. Heavy garments were sometimes pre-dried indoors near the hearth before being fully aired outside. If rain threatened, the entire schedule could be ruined, and washing delayed. Thus, laundry cycles were always at the mercy of the weather. Because clothes took so long to wash, rinse, dry, and store, most families practiced rotation. Only one category of clothing was washed at a time: undergarments in May, beddings in June, outerwear in late summer. ceremonial garments before holidays or feasts. This allowed time for each group to be processed fully and prevented a household from being left without essential clothing. Laundry was a calendar task. It fit into agricultural rhythms and feast days. It was aligned with solar patterns, religious fasts, and market days. In some monasteries, records were kept showing when laundry had last been done, sometimes even who had washed it. In large households, castles, and monasteries, laundry became a formal operation. Laundresses were paid staff and often managed others beneath them. They reported to the housekeeper or chamberlain and had their own inventories. Everything was labeled. Garments were tracked by owner, material, and purpose. Some even marked clothing with charcoal numbers, knotted tags, or stitched initials to avoid confusion. The laundry cycle in these places was relentless. Every day brought more cloth: napkins, tablecloths, towels, altar cloths, sheets for guests, tunics for servants, and all had to be processed with care. For the poor, it was a harder cycle. Among the poor, things were even more precarious. Washing was done less frequently, often in secret, and with little access to herbs or ash. Clothes were worn thin before being cleaned. Washing sometimes hastened the death of a garment, especially if it couldn't be properly dried. Still, even in poverty, the laundry cycle was honored. Clothes were aired in sunlight, brushed with reeds, and occasionally rubbed with vinegar or fermented grain mash to remove odor. Every act of cleaning was an act of dignity. And so we see, the medieval laundry cycle was not just a random act of scrubbing and rinsing. It was a ritual, a process built on experience, necessity, and care. From sorting and soaking, to scrubbing and rinsing, to infusing and drying. Laundry was a system, a season, a social ritual. It was a time to gather, a time to care for what little one had, a time to carry on wisdom, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. And with garments now rinsed, herbs gently perfuming the air, and linens drying on the line. We moved to the next phase in our journey, how garments were dried, folded, and stored. Our garments have now been rinsed. They are clean, soaked in river water, and scented with rosemary or lavender. But our journey is not yet over. What happens next is just as crucial, because in the medieval world, how clothes were dried, folded, and stored could determine whether they lasted or rotted. This was not just an afterthought. It was a craft in itself. Let us begin with drying, the most delicate balance of all. Clean garments, now heavy with water, needed to be dried carefully and quickly. If dried too slowly, mold could set in. If dried too fast in direct heat, fabric could become stiff or even shrink. The consequences of improper drying were dire. Wool could felt or shrink. Linen could yellow or stiffen. Dampness could breed mildew and pests. And remember, for most people, each garment was precious. Losing one shirt to rot meant weeks of discomfort, or worse. So drying became an art. Most commonly, laundry was dried outdoors, near the washing site or at the homestead. In villages, it wasn't unusual to see garments draped over hedges, stone walls, or bushes, large cloaks or sheets spread across grassy meadows, linen laid over smooth rocks, especially those warmed by sunlight. If the weather was favorable, warm but not too hot, breezy but not stormy, drying could happen within hours. But nature was not always kind. To cope, medieval people developed a variety of clever drying methods. 1. Ropes and lines. In more organized homes, hemp or flaxen ropes were strung between trees, beams, or poles. These served as primitive clotheslines. Garments were secured using twisted wooden pegs, thorns from hawthorn or blackthorn bushes, stones placed on corners to weigh cloth down. These lines were typically reserved for lighter garments, like underclothes or shirts, because heavy items could cause ropes to snap. 2. Drying frames. In wealthier homes or religious institutions, wooden drying racks were used. These frames allowed clothes to dry off the ground, safe from animals, dirt, and pests. The fabrics could be laid flat, stretched, or hung loosely. Monasteries often had entire laundry yards, where drying frames were positioned to catch the best sunlight and air currents. 3. Indoor drying. When weather didn't cooperate, or during the winter, drying moved indoors. Clothes were hung near the hearth, over rafters, or strung across beams. This created a smoky scent, but kept fabric warm and protected from rain. In castles and larger homes, drying galleries were sometimes built near kitchen chimneys to take advantage of rising warmth. Still, indoor drying was slow and not ideal. Linen and wool, the most common fabrics, required different drying care. Linen loved sunlight, dried quickly, became whiter and softer with sun exposure, often laid flat or draped to prevent harsh fold lines. While wool dried in the shade, away from direct sun or fire, hung or laid flat, never stretched, risked shrinking or felting if exposed to heat. Sometimes blotted with cloths first to remove moisture. Clothing made from both materials required compromise, sometimes drying the linen portions first, then reshaping the wool parts slowly. People learned by feel, by smell, by the weight of the fabric. It was a tactile knowledge passed through generations, beating, brushing, and finishing. Drying was not the final step. After garments had dried, they were often beaten or brushed. This served several purposes: removed dried-on dust or sand, softened stiff fabric, smoothed wrinkles, released trapped insects or larvae. Stiff brushes made of reeds, coarse fibers, or boar bristles were used. In some areas, combs made from bone or wood helped align fabric grain, especially for table linens and altar cloths. Beating cloth was especially common for wool items. It loosened fibers, restored softness, and shook out debris. Some linen garments were even ironed, not with metal, but with a smoothing stone or pressing board, often warmed by the hearth. Folding, a matter of pride. Folding may sound mundane, but in the medieval world, it was an act of honor and presentation. Properly folded garments took up less storage space, were easier to layer and transport, signified a well-run household, helped garments retain their shape. Linen was folded with crisp creases, sometimes into long, narrow bands for easier stacking. Woolen items were often rolled instead of folded to prevent crease lines that might break the fibers. In religious houses, altar cloths were folded in prescribed ways, sometimes with symbolic meaning, while in noble homes, servants were trained in folding etiquette. Even peasants, with only a few garments, took time to fold and stack clothes neatly, often wrapped in cloth or tied with string. Between the folds, people layered aromatic herbs, lavender for scent and moth prevention, bay leaves to repel flies, rosemary, thought to purify, sage and thyme, believed to bring luck, pennyroyal and wormwood, to keep fleas away. In wealthier households, garments were wrapped in linen bags, dusted with dried herbs, or infused with oils. This wasn't just for fragrance. Herbs played a critical role in pest control, especially during long storage periods. Once folded and scented, clothing was stored, but where? They were stored in chests, coffers. The most common storage unit was the wooden chest. Chests were made from oak, elm, or pine and lined with cloth, wax, or paper. Sometimes the chests were carved with symbols for protection. Clothes were stacked inside, separated by linen sheets or wrapped in bundles. Chests were kept off the ground, often placed on bricks or stands to avoid moisture. Some of these chests had compartments or trays for herbs and sachets. Chests weren't just for clothes. They often held bedding, scrolls, and personal relics. They were also heirlooms, passed through families for generations. In castles and manor homes, armoires or wall-mounted pegs might be used. Wool cloaks were hung to retain shape. Still, most common folk relied on chests or simply wrapped clothes in clean sheets and placed them in lofts, attics, or underbeds. Seasonal storage and putting clothes to sleep. When winter came, light linens and summer clothing were stored away. This act was called, by some, putting the clothes to sleep. People folded garments with dried herbs, wrapped them in waxed cloth or oiled paper, tucked them into sealed chests, and sometimes added salt to absorb moisture. These clothes would not be seen again until spring, when the whole laundry cycle would begin again. In monasteries, the changing of seasonal garments was often accompanied by ceremonial cleaning days, where the laundry team worked for weeks at a time, laundry and status. A well-dried and folded shirt might look plain, but it was a mark of pride. A well-kept laundry reflected a woman's care for her family, a servant's attention to duty, a monastery's discipline, a household's social rank. Even traveling merchants took time to air out and fold garments between journeys. A crumpled tunic was considered a sign of laziness, or worse, poverty. The role of the laundress. In larger homes, the laundress was a highly respected servant. She had her own tools, wooden smoothing boards, herb sachets, brushes and beating frames, measuring sticks for folding. Her duties were precise. Her folding could be inspected, her storage methods dictated by protocol, and her role, quiet though it was, kept the household running. Drying, folding, and storing. Simple acts at first glance, but in truth, they were rituals, performed with care, tradition, and often reverence. They preserved garments through long winters. They protected families from pests and rot, and they honored the labor of those who washed and wore each piece. As our clothes are now tucked away, crisp, scented, and safe, we prepare to close our story on medieval laundry in Europe. But not before one last journey. Let us turn now examine the tools, terms, and traditions that made medieval laundry not just a task, but a heritage. As we reach the final folds of our journey through medieval laundry in Europe, we now turn our gaze to the tools that shaped it, the words that preserved it, and the traditions that gave it life. Because medieval laundering was more than just physical labor. It was a culture, handed down with beetles and baskets, with whispers over riverbanks, and rituals beside steaming tubs. Essential laundry tools of the medieval era. Let's begin with the objects, humble and handmade, that filled every washing scene from manor to meadow. 1. Beetles, laundry paddles. A beetle, or laundry bat, was a flat, broad wooden paddle, often with a rounded or grooved edge. It was used to beat wet fabric, particularly linen, against the stone or board. Beetles came in many forms, hand-carved from oak or ash, short-handled for controlled strikes, long-handled for larger items like sheets. Some were smooth, others had ridges to agitate cloth. Their rhythmic sound, thump, slap, splash, was the percussion of every wash day. Over time, a laundress's beetle became a personal item, worn smooth by her grip, her strength etched into its handle. 2. Scrubbing stones and washing slabs. Natural flat stones near rivers were ideal for scrubbing. Some were marked or even carved over generations of use. In monastic or urban settings, dedicated washing slabs were constructed, made of smooth stone, brick, or even slate. A good scrubbing surface needed to be smooth enough to protect fabric, flat enough for proper pounding, slightly angled to allow water drainage. In France, these were sometimes called planches à laver. 3. Wooden tubs and barrels. Large barrels, casks, or tubs were used for soaking and washing. Tubs were made from oak staves, sealed with iron hoops, and lined with wax or pitch to prevent leaks, and sometimes fitted with drainage plugs. In wealthier homes, copper or lead-lined tubs existed, especially for winter indoor washing. These tubs could also be used for steeping lye, the process of extracting alkaline solution from ash. 4th, rinsing baskets and strainers. To rinse garments in moving water, laundresses often used woven reed baskets. These allowed water to flow freely, garments to stay contained, and reduced the risk of cloth floating away. Some baskets had fitted lids, while others were weighed down with stones. They could be dipped, swirled, and lifted repeatedly, offering a gentler rinse than river stone pounding. 5. Brushes and combs. After drying, garments were often brushed. These brushes were made from boar hair, straw bundles, twisted rope ends. For fine fabrics, wooden combs, similar to weaving combs, were used to realign the fibers, especially after air drying. 6. Drying equipment. Drying tools included ropes of hemp or flax, wooden pegs or thorn hooks, drying frames, rectangular racks with crossbars, warming stones, heated stones placed beneath woolens to aid drying indoors. Some laundresses used pressing boards to flatten fabric post-drying, applying pressure with smooth stones or even bricks wrapped in cloth. Natural cleaning agents and their use. Without commercial soaps, medieval people used what nature provided: ash lye, made by steeping wood ash in boiling water. It released potassium carbonate, forming a mild alkaline solution. It is used to soak linen, work clothes, and cloths with grease or sweat stains. It was filtered through linen bags and stored in wooden barrels. Chamber lye, fermented urine collected from chamber pots. Rich in ammonia, it was a surprisingly effective degreaser. It was used for stains on wool and linen, whitening fabric, loosening caked-on dirt. It is often heated or mixed with ash water for stronger effect. Fuller's earth and clay. Absorbent earths, such as kaolin or chalky clays, were applied to oily stains. They were rubbed into fabric, left to dry, then brushed off. Some monasteries had dedicated clay stores for laundering vestments and altar linens, herbal additions, rosemary for purification, lavender for moth protection, thyme to fight mildew, marjoram and sage for scent. When infused into rinsed water, these added both aroma and antimicrobial properties. Laundry terms and language. Laundry was such a central part of life, it developed its own vocabulary. Here are just a few terms from medieval life. Beetling, the act of striking fabric to soften and clean it. Buckwashing, soaking clothes in lye or urine overnight. Hulling, bleaching cloth by laying it in the sun. Wringing, twisting cloth to extract water, often done in pairs. The Great Wash, the seasonal large-scale laundry effort, often spring. In some dialects, laundry was called bucking in Old English records, lessive in French, waschen in Germanic regions. Some households kept laundry books, small ledgers where cloth usage and washes were logged, especially in abbeys or noble estates. Laundry was not only practical, it was ritualized, even spiritual in some communities. In parts of Europe, rivers were believed to host spirits or guardians. Some laundresses left tokens, such as herbs, flowers, or coins, before beginning their work. Certain stones were considered sacred, and some rivers were off-limits for washing altogether. Some believed washing clothes during a waning moon made them dry faster. Others said stains came out better under a full moon. Washing on holy days was discouraged, sometimes even forbidden. Many laundresses sang while they worked. Songs helped pass time, synchronize rhythm, warn children away from dangerous riverbanks, teach younger girls the steps of the process. Some songs had coded meanings, passed down through generations. It was common to speak blessings over garments used for childbirth, illness, or funerals. In monasteries, linen for the altar was washed only by certain hands and dried in silence. In noble homes, garments for the feast day were sprinkled with rosewater and prayed over. Let us not forget the people behind this work. The village washerwoman was a pillar of the community, often elderly, experienced, and deeply respected. She knew every stain, every type of cloth, every drying wind. The monastic laundress, silent, dutiful, and precise. She kept inventories, scrubbed vestments, and ensured purity in cloth used for worship. Her role was spiritual as much as physical. The castle laundry maid. In noble houses, entire teams handled laundry. One for soaking, one for beating, one for drying, one for brushing and folding. The head laundress was often paid more than many kitchen workers. The itinerant washer. Some women traveled from village to village, offering services. They carried beetles, brushes, herbs, and stories from town to town. Washing was how they earned their bread and their place in the world. The legacy of medieval laundry. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of medieval laundering remain in language, in ritual, in the quiet, meditative rhythm of washing by hand. It teaches us to care, to take our time, to understand that even the simplest acts, scrubbing a shirt, folding a sheet, airing a cloak, can hold meaning, and that labor done with care is never truly forgotten. So the beetles are set down, the garments are folded, the chests are closed. Now we will delve deep, very deep, into how people in medieval Asia washed their clothes. Unlike Europe's relatively uniform approach to laundry, which mostly involved beating fabric until it surrendered, Asia's methods varied dramatically by region, climate, and social class. China, where silk was sacred and cotton was beaten like a criminal. In imperial China, laundry practices were strictly divided by fabric type. Silk garments for the elite. Silk was not so much washed as it was ritually pampered. The process began with careful unpicking of seams to prevent shrinkage. The fabric was then hand agitated in lukewarm water, never hot, as heat damaged the fibers. Mild cleansers like rice starch or soapberry extract were used. Soapberries, or Cepindus mucorosi, produced a natural saponin that created weak suds. This was the closest thing to detergent available, and it was pitifully ineffective by modern standards. After washing, silk was never wrung out. Instead, it was gently pressed between towels and laid flat to dry in shade. Direct sunlight would fade the dyes. Ironing. Unthinkable. Silk was smoothed with hand-held warmers, filled with hot sand or coals. The entire process for a single robe could take 3 days. The peasants wore cotton and hemp. If silk was treated like a fragile heirloom, cotton and hemp were beaten into submission. Clothes were soaked in wood ash lye, similar to Europe, or boiled in cauldrons. They were then pounded on river rocks, or thrashed with wooden paddles. Some regions used stomping pits, where barefoot workers trampled fabric for hours. Archaeological evidence from Fujian province suggests some laundry pits were used for centuries, wearing deep grooves into the stone. In Japan, laundry was a ceremony. In medieval Japan, washing clothes was as ritualized as tea ceremonies, just far less dignified. The kimono is one of the native attire of the Japanese, and the kimono washing was a labor of maddening precision. A single kimono contained up to 20 meters of fabric, so washing one was a logistical nightmare. First, the garment was completely disassembled. Each panel was hand-scrubbed with fermented rice bran, nuka, a weak cleanser that also acted as a fabric softener. Stains were spot-treated with clay paste or persimmon tannin. After rinsing, the fabric was stretched on bamboo frames to dry, a process that could take 2 full days. Wealthy households employed specialized laundry servants whose only job was kimono maintenance. Their existence was monotonous beyond belief. Another Japanese attire was the indigo, dyed fabric known as azome. Japan's beloved indigo-dyed fabrics, azome, bled color when wet to prevent fading. Clothes were washed inside out in cold water. Salt or vinegar was added to fix the dye. Even with these precautions, indigo garments still faded over time, requiring frequent redyeing. In medieval India, where soap nuts grew on trees, but laundry was still miserable. India had one advantage over Europe. It had an abundance of soap nuts, retha, a natural cleaning agent. This did not, however, make laundry pleasant. The soap nut process. Soap nuts were boiled into a weak, frothy liquid. Clothes were soaked in this solution, then agitated by hand or beaten on rocks. For stubborn stains, fuller's earth, a type of clay, was applied as a paste. This was somewhat effective for grease, but required hours of scrubbing. The curse of stiff cotton. After washing, cotton garments were often stiff as wood. To soften them, they were beaten again. Yes, really. Sometimes rice starch was added for body, though this attracted insects. In Bengal, a yogurt rinse was used to neutralize odors. This worked moderately well, but left clothes smelling faintly of sour milk. The social hierarchy of laundry. Just as in Europe, laundry in Asia was deeply tied to class. Elites avoided washing clothes entirely when possible. Silk robes were aired out or perfumed instead of laundered. The wealthy changed underlayers frequently, preserving outer garments. In Japan, aristocrats sometimes burned incense inside their sleeves to mask odors. This did not work as well as they hoped. Peasants had no such luxuries. Their clothes were washed infrequently, often just before festivals. It was not uncommon for rural workers to own only 2 outfits, one being washed while the other was worn. In monsoon regions, however, mildew was a constant battle. Innovations, if you can call them that. Medieval Asia did develop a few labor-intensive advancements. Bamboo drying racks. Unlike Europe's haphazard hedge drying, parts of China and Japan used adjustable bamboo frames. These allowed better airflow, reduced wrinkling, a slightly faster drying time, though fast, still meant 12+ hours. Steam pressing. In Korea, heavy iron pots filled with hot water were rolled over fabric to smooth wrinkles. This was dangerous, as burns were common and inefficient. One robe took an hour to press. Scented rinses. Some households soaked clothes in scented water, jasmine, sandalwood, after washing. The effect was subtle and lasted approximately 1 hour in humid climates. The unchanging chore. Laundry is one of humanity's oldest tasks. and in some parts of the world, it remains unchanged for centuries. While Europe and Asia eventually moved on to mechanized washing, many regions in Africa still rely on methods that would be familiar to a medieval laundress. This is not for historical reenactment, but simple necessity. In rural villages, along riverbanks, and in crowded urban compounds, women, and it is almost always women, still scrub, beat, and sun-dry clothes, just as their ancestors did. Today, we will take an excruciatingly detailed journey through these surviving traditions, from the soap nut gatherers of West Africa to the communal washing rocks of East Africa. Prepare for a slow, uneventful immersion into the world of hand washing that refuses to die. West Africa, where soap nuts and fermented starch still reign. 1. The enduring legacy of soap nuts. In the forests of Nigeria, Ghana, and Burkina Faso, women still collect the wrinkled brown pods of the soap nut tree, botanical name Sapindus mucorosi. These unassuming fruits contain saponin, a natural detergent that has been used for washing since antiquity. The process is unchanged. The nuts are cracked open and soaked in warm water. After hours of steeping, the liquid turns frothy. Clothes are submerged and agitated by hand, though some still use wooden paddles for stubborn stains. The result? A weak but serviceable clean, far gentler than modern detergents, but also far less effective. 2. The fermented cassava method, a sticky solution. In Benin and Togo, another ancient technique persists, the use of fermented cassava slurry. Cassava tubers are left to rot slightly, just enough to break down their starches. The resulting mush is mixed with water to form a slippery, slightly acidic paste. Clothes are rubbed with this gloop before being beaten against rocks. The cassava acts as both a cleanser and a stiffening agent, leaving fabrics crisp, but smelling faintly of sourdough. 3. The social ritual of river washing. Unlike the solitary suffering of medieval Europe, West African laundry is often a communal affair. Women gather at the same riverbanks their mothers and grandmothers used. They scrub, slap clothes on rocks, and exchange gossip in equal measure. Children play in the shallows while their mothers work. It is a scene that would look entirely normal. In the year 1423, East Africa, where washing rocks are worn. Smooth by centuries of labor, in the highlands of Ethiopia, near ancient Christian settlements, smooth, flat stones line the riverbanks. These are not natural formations. They have been polished by generations of women kneeling, scrubbing, and beating clothes against them. The technique is simple. Garments are soaked in ash-laced water, then pounded rhythmically against the stone. The process is repeated until the water runs clear, or until exhaustion sets in. Some of these stones have been in use for so long, they have developed shallow depressions where countless hands have pressed fabric into them. 2nd, Lake Victoria's floating laundresses. On the shores of Lake Victoria, women wade waist-deep into the water, balancing baskets of dirty clothes on their heads. Here, washing is a full-body workout. Clothes are swirled in the lake to loosen dirt, then scrubbed with rough sand as an abrasive. Finally, they are whipped against the water's surface to rinse. The method is effective, if backbreaking. 3. The persistence of animal fat soap. In South Sudan and rural Kenya, a medieval European staple survives, soap made from animal fat and ash. The recipe is unchanged. Fat is rendered from cow or goat bones, mixed with potash from burned plantain peels, boiled into a crude, greasy soap that smells like burnt hair. It works, but no one enjoys using it. Southern Africa, where laundry meets colonial hangovers, the lingering influence of European lye. In the villages of Zimbabwe and Malawi, colonial-era lye, soap recipes stubbornly persist. Women still leach potassium carbonate from wood ash. Mix it with whatever fat is available, often goat or chicken. Boil it into a harsh, skin-stripping paste. The soap cleans, but also bleaches fabric and leaves hands cracked and raw. In urban settlements, where rivers are polluted or inaccessible, women boil clothes in giant metal drums over open fires. Clothes stew for hours in a mix of detergent and baking soda. Then they are stirred with sticks, like some unappetizing laundry soup. Finally, they are wrung out and hung on fences or rooftops. The method is resource-intensive. but effective in areas without running water. Why these methods survive? A depressing reality check. 1. Poverty and the lack of alternatives. In many regions, washing machines are either unaffordable or impractical without reliable electricity or plumbing. 2. Cultural inertia. When a method has worked for centuries, why change it, even if it is exhausting? 3. The illusion of natural cleaning. Some believe traditional methods are gentler or eco-friendlier, ignoring the back pain and hours of labor involved, a future still tethered to the past. While the developed world spins clothes in stainless steel drums, much of Africa remains stuck in the same cycles of toil that defined the Middle Ages. Progress comes slowly, if at all, and so, the soap nuts are still gathered, the rocks are still beaten smooth, and the women still kneel by the river, just as they have for 1,000 years. And so, dear listener, as we come to the end of our long and lathered journey through the soapy corridors of medieval laundry, perhaps you find yourself reclining a little deeper into the pillows, the weight of the day gently pressing itself into the mattress below you. The world of the Middle Ages, once filled with bustling marketplaces, clattering wooden buckets, linen tunics, and streams echoing with the gentle splash of suds and soapwort, now softens into the hush of a time long past. You may remember the women who knelt by the riverside, sleeves rolled high, hands red and raw in the cold, lye-scented waters, scrubbing and beating linen against smooth stones. The sound of wood clapping wet fabric, a rhythm of duty, slow, steady, hypnotic. You may see them now, in your mind's eye, heads wrapped in kerchiefs, skirts damp at the hem, voices low as they murmured to one another in the hush of shared labor. There is something soothing in their work, methodical, timeless, almost meditative. Laundry was not